Hello and welcome to Book Lovers Companion. My name is Edith and I have a wonderful guest with me who wrote a very fast-paced military thriller. Joining me from across the pond is my guest, Dr. Bruce Farmer. Hello and welcome to Book Lovers Companion.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you on the show, and we are going to talk about Blood Sapphire's Revenge, your book which came out in 2021. And my first question would be, you write in your disclaimer it's completely fictitious. Are you quite certain it is?
Well, that is a complex question. And in order to answer complex questions, you have to divide the question. It's everything. It is an imaginative creation. It's an imagined world, but I enter a created universe, as you will, with facts on the ground. It's not when in this case, the protagonist, Staff Sergeant Hattie Abrams, is a sniper, a renowned, one of the top 7 in the world. They're generally 7 snipers. It maybe 10 in the world at any time amongst that community that are considered the best. And she's considered one of those. So when she holds a Macmillan 50 caliber TAC 50, sniper rifle in her hand, I feel incumbent upon me to put the reader in touch with her world as intimately as I can make it, to feel the weight of a 30-pound cannon, to hear the sound, even with a suppressor on it that's almost larger than the 110 decibels that shatters your eardrums. These sniper weapons they're big. And it's made in Canada. And how did I get that? Well, you go online and you can check all of the stats on the long distance shots. And one of the longest shots ever was by a Canadian sniper using that weapon in Afghanistan. And his description of how that happened, putting you in his shoes as he made that shot, which was nearly a mile. I mean, it was just a mile and a half. It was a massive distance. And in the book, her first shot misses the target. Well, in the real life event, with his spotter present, the distance was so far that when he kind of geared it in, he missed the target. The bullet went over the Taliban's. There were 2 Taliban in a desert, a complete desert on a tiny little road or track. And the bullet went over them and fell harmlessly beyond them, maybe 15 feet. And it just made a puff. And the distance is so long that they never heard the report. It's all silent. So he had time to reload and readjust and make the second shot, which took out the Taliban. And suddenly I went, there you go. That's the shot I want Staff Sergeant Hattie Abrams to make.
You said you researched online. Sometimes I do wonder, are authors afraid who will come knocking at their door when they do online research a lot for the books?
Well, as you have seen, just kind of a looking at my library. I don't know, again, if you're viewers, this is my little hidey hole, and it's packed full of hundreds and hundreds of volumes. And this was my nature when I practiced medicine, when I studied theology. When I have a question, I like to investigate it as exhaustively as possible within reason.
Mm-hmm.
So, when it came to the world of sniping, I have a library of sniping books,
Oh,
and I have the Sniper's Bible somewhere. And so you facilitate your research through, obviously the online gives you an entry. It's a little door into a world, but then it's literature itself. It's autobiographical accounts. It's the Sniper's Bible, which will tell you, as again with Hattie Abrams' shot, there are over 30 variables that affect a bullet's flight over a mile and a half. The rotation of the earth itself, called the Coriolis effect. The bullet is in flight so long, 4 seconds, that in 4 seconds, the rotation of the earth has rotated on its axis 12 feet. And if you're not aware of that, everything could be perfect and the bullet would still miss because you haven't factored in the fact you're on a globe spinning throughout the universe. And so in this case, I set up the shot on an east-west axis in Yemen, so that if you're on an east-west axis, it eliminates the Coriolis effect. I didn't want to factor that in, so I removed it by making it an east-west shot.
Okay. Yeah, understandable.
Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, but sometimes I wonder and authors also say that research is what they enjoy immensely. Most of you authors do, and which I absolutely understand. I absolutely get that. And yet at the same time, they also sometimes are afraid that they might get lost, not in translation, but in research. They fall into the rabbit hole and have a hard time getting out of it.
Well, I was saved by my editor. I found an editor after a long, long process of rejections and rejections and rejections. And finally, when I decided to self-publish, because I realized then that I wanted to maintain control over the product, I found a site that was kind of a members-only site for editors, internationally renowned editors, and you can only be on the site if you are. And they had a very simple thing. Choose 3 of the following people. Send them 10 pages of your book. They'll get back to you maybe. And I went, okay. No, it was the most simple, and I sent 10 pages to these 3 editors whose, their works were just amazing, and from Nobel Prize people and everything, and I got a response from all 3, and I was shocked. And I finally, one of the people that responded was a former prosecutor for the New Jersey system of justice. She was a former prosecutor. She was a Krav Maga self-defense expert, very Jewish. But wow, she took my 120 words and she removed chapters. When you're talking about diving into rabbit holes, I had rabbit holes of material on, the nuclear complex that's hidden in Russia, where, all of this stuff that I'd done months and months and months, and I had all these stories about this. She just removed it. And I went, Karen, I said, Karen, that was like months of work on Major so-and-so and his heist of this plutonium. She says, it doesn't help the book. Get rid of it.
But
So
yeah,
that was my solution. I didn't have a solution. Karen did. She
yeah.
simply went through, she took it from 120,000 words to 90.
Hmm.
She just went boom, boom, 30,000 words gone, which was extremely painful. But
Yeah,
yeah,
I can
anyway.
imagine. Yeah, I can imagine. You did all the hard work and you wanted to show what you know. I mean,
Oh yeah,
understandable.
it
Yeah,
was, yeah.
yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. May I ask about the plot itself? Where did you come up with the idea? Where did you find the idea for the plot of the book?
Um, in I left medicine. I practiced trauma surgery, and I trained in trauma and burns, and then I practiced in emergency medicine. And then uh, in 1999, decided that I had a longing for. I'm a kind of philosophically driven individually. I like diving deep in the in questions that, and I had always, since the early 70s, been perplexed with this question about free will and sovereignty. Or if you're an atheist, it'd be free will and biological determinism or chemical determinism. How is it possible that we have what we call free will, or so we believe that it's free will, and we live in a determined universe? How is that possible to reconcile from a theological, standpoint? So I left medicine to pursue a thesis, pursue this question. And in the process, the year was 2000. I had this moment. I think all of us in our lives have these moments when we pass through kind of like a sine wave, where there are parts in our lives where we come into areas of great creative potential bursting. And sometimes we lapse in the years where we're just kind of languid, not knowing what we're doing on the planet. And then we come into these moments where suddenly well, in the year 2000, I was looking out the window of seminary out onto this. It was kind of a beautiful little wooded area. And I kind of suddenly saw in a moment the solution to my free will sovereignty issue when a crowd of crows burst from the ground and went into the air and formed a flock of birds. It hit me that in that, so I'm in this moment or in this time of creative insight, and I was reading the book of Esther, and um, this is the story. It's yeah, this is this is one of those stories in the Old Testament where God is not mentioned. It's interesting. And yet um we have this moment where this Jewish orphan named Hadassah is she's she's taken under the wing of Mordecai, her uncle. And as it turns out, this is the 5th century Persian Empire ruling of the world. And Artaxerxes says, I'm going to, I want, my Queen Vashti she's not worthy to wear the crown. And his advisor says, look, let's have beautiful women come into your kingdom and you can choose which one you want. And as it turns out, Esther, or Hadassah, is chosen to be queen. And Mordecai says, look, just don't tell the king what race you are. Don't tell the king that you're Jewish. So, as it turns out very quickly in the short story, um, uh, an enemy of the Jews rises up, Haman, and he decides he's going to destroy the Jewish race. And in this fateful moment, Mordecai gets word to Esther, says, you should talk to the king about this, because, and she said, well, she hadn't heard anything about it because she's enclosed. And she says, I don't think you understand. No one can just walk into the king's room without being summoned, or it's worthy of death. I'll just be killed. And he said, maybe for this moment, maybe for such a time as this, you were born. And that has gripped me as I think of, I like Greek tragedy, and I like Greek literature and classical Greek, and how they look at fate and destiny and sin, all of these Greek concepts and in Greek literature, there's this distinction between destiny, what are we being pulled into, and fate, what has life dealt us as we come out of the womb, what are the cards in our hands, and destiny is kind of how do you play them. Destiny is where you take it. And so I felt that this question has always had impact for me. It's a question I ask myself a lot. Maybe even today, I wake up and I ask myself, maybe for this day you were born. Maybe there's a moment today that is calling something forth from you that, and so he says to Esther, maybe this is your moment. But if you don't act, know that there'll be a solution. But maybe this is your moment. Well, in the book, suddenly it hit me. What would it be like if you transported this Persian queen of great beauty and wisdom into the 20th century and made her a spec ops elite sniper in the Israeli Defense Force, and put her in a position where she herself stands at that same moment where Mordecai is asking her? In this case, it's the Mossad director who calls her on the phone out of the blue at her lowest spot in the book and says, we have a guy who's going to destroy Jerusalem with nuclear-tipped missiles. And we know that this is going to happen. We're not exactly sure. We don't know who he is or where he is. But we know that he knows about you, because every time we look, he's trying to kill you. You seem to be in his sights. We don't understand why, but it's not a problem. You let him come towards you, and we will be there when he comes. And she says, well, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard of. You're asking me to be a goat. And he says, well, there are worse things in life. There are worse things than dying for your country. Dying for your country. It's called shame. Shame not having stood up to do what was called of you. And he leaves her with that. And as it turns out, she makes the decision to step up to the plate and saves her nation. That all came to me in this boom. It was just this moment. And I went, wow, that would be something. And that's how the plot was born. What would it be like to take that woman and bring her into our century and put her into a situation which she can't win? There's no way she can win except to sacrifice herself.
Mm. And she did. We do not want to give too much away. Of course, dear listeners, you should read the book.
Yeah.
Like I said, fast-paced military thriller, and there's so much going on in this book of yours. There are so many threads in your book which come together perfectly in the end. Because also the other characters in your book, her best friend, who's also, is she a sniper? Yeah, I think no, not really. Isn't
Well,
no, she's her
Shira,
partner when they when they
Yeah,
work
Shira
together.
is the spotter.
Yeah.
Shira is her
Okay.
spotter, but
Yeah.
in a sniper-spotter relationship, that's
Yeah.
pretty close.
Yeah.
They're the ones that go on missions, yeah.
Yeah. And there was also, I mean, there are a lot of baddies involved. Of course, there are,
Yes.
And it reminds me a little bit, or you come to think of it, what you wrote. I mean, I was listening to Anne Applebaum recently again, and I have her book, Authority Inc., and how those baddies in the real world, the politicians, let's call the politicians, which they are, wants to work together. A bit like those baddies, in, I don't know, mafia bosses and mobsters,
Yes.
and they all have
Yes.
interests in the same things and to work
Yes.
together. And because you mentioned Japan, you mentioned the Japanese Yakuza, you mentioned, I don't know, the Russian mobs, and everything is working against our hero.
Yes.
And we are thrown from, like you said, it starts in Yemen, then we are back in the United States, and then we are wherever the Betty number one is. We don't know. We find out during the book about more, not precisely, but we
Yes.
do, and that's what I like. I mean, in your book, it's not just everything's up and done, yeah, perfectly done, and the hero prevails, yeah, which we don't know because, like you said, she's at her lowest point, and she
Yeah.
has to do what she has to do, and it's all about sacrifice, willing to be, like you said, the goat, willing to be the bait for the greater
Yes.
good.
And also, for me, which happens early in the first 15 chapters of the book, is we're introduced very quickly. I wanted a character. I chose Israel. I chose Hattie Abrams to
Mm.
be Jewish because I felt that of all, I just have this sense that they are a nation that has been, it's like every kind of dross and metal and dirt and clay, everything goes into a smelting pot in the Jewish nation. And in the last 100 years, it's just been this, they are a nation that exists with an ever present existential threat of
Yes.
annihilation. And I've been on 2 extended studies in Israel. So you sit in that culture and you realize they live and breathe in an atmosphere where something terrible could happen any moment.
Mm.
And I don't, it's just this whatever. So I thought, what better culture to find a protagonist, someone who is at their wits' end as a
Yeah.
culture. And as it turns out, Hattie Abrams is, because she's someone who's an existentialist. And from early on, from high school days, I started reading Kierkegaard, Soren Kierkegaard. And to me, the antithesis of Soren Kierkegaard has always been Friedrich Nietzsche. And Nietzsche's Thus Spake Zarathustra, and the madman who's running throughout at midnight, and he's got the bloody knife, and he's saying, we've killed him, we killed God. And the question is, well, how do you kill God? He says, well, you kill God by your unbelief. The culture has become so dead and so unalive to God that he died. Kierkegaard, of course, is the existentialist of belief. But his is a belief that is, we are in a pot of water that is getting warmed, and we don't know anything about boiling points. We're just watching this water get warmer, and suddenly it starts to boil. There's a point where it starts to boil, and we go, wait a minute, it was liquid, and now it's bubbling. How did that happen? It was a leap into something that we hadn't anticipated. And Kierkegaard is saying that we reach a spot where you can study all you want, you can go to church all you want, you can do whatever you want. Your Christianity, your belief in God is meaningless. It's nothing. It's just culture until you reach that boiling point in your own life where suddenly faith explodes into a leap, and you leap with total uncertainty towards God. So it's a very different. So Hattie Abrams is someone who is, I mean, the real one of the crux problems of the book is that her father was murdered on the day of her birth.
Yeah.
And as we find out, the bad guy, X, is the one who has murdered her father. And so she has wrestled all her life with the fact that when she goes to celebrate her birthday, it's the very day that her father was murdered.
Yeah.
And it has created in her this existential dilemma of what is the meaning of life? I go to celebrate something and life has no meaning because my father was murdered. I don't know who did it. And there's this very real sense of meaninglessness that grips Hattie Abrams. And so, as the reader, I don't think I'm giving too much away to say that she goes to commit suicide after this record-setting shot.
Yeah.
And her best buddy Shira knows that she's figures she's going to, but doesn't have anything to say about it. And in fact, Hattie will go into the Benjamin Forest and find a place, which, by the way, that scene was taken out of the Narnian Chronicles. I think it was the second book, but it's the pool, the quiet pool in the middle of the forest that is reflective and burbling. Even in the midst of a storm, there's this little pool that she finds, and she recognizes that's the place I'm going to commit suicide. I'm going to take matters into my own hands. And on the day, I'm not going to face another day, another birthday, my 27th birthday, where my dad dies and I'm being, so I'm going to kill myself and I'm going to take care of this myself on my own terms.
Yes. Be the master,
And
the mistress of her fate then, her destiny.
Yes. In other words, she is going to take her own fate into her hands. Now, again, early on in the book, we learn that Hattie Abrams has been exposed to some unique spiritual events. And I got this moment when when she turns 13, her bat mitzvah, where she has this moment where she's crying out to God. She has a hunger for God, and she sees flames of fire coming out of her fingers, and actually a red sword. She holds this flaming sword for this instant. And people have said, well, that's ridiculous. That never happens. But in fact, we have, if you're familiar with the writings of the Desert Fathers, recount these kinds of things. These kind of spiritual experiences are not that unusual, where things like that happen. So she's had this moment when she was 13, very special, and now 12, 13, and now here she is. She's gone through a very bad situation when she turns 14. She's a swimsuit model, and something terrible happens to her. And because of that, she comes to curse God. And she says, you, pointing at Chagall's White Crucifixion, which hangs on the wall of her, says, you did this. You were the one that allowed this rape to happen. You were the cause. And so she's had this relationship with God that is both amazing and yet deplorable, the extremes. And here she is, she's going to commit suicide. And all I can say at that moment is I don't use the word God in this book, that in that moment, but we can just say that there's an intervention
Mm,
that stays her hand.
mm. Yes. And come to think of it, would you agree that, okay, she wants to take her life at this moment, being at her lowest point, and then she is offered, if you want to die, give it meaning. Give your death meaning.
Yes.
Because that's what's happening when she gets the call. You have to be the goat. Okay, now I get my wish. I get my death wish on the one hand, maybe, or maybe not. We don't know.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I can put meaning to my death. Unlike I
Yes.
commit suicide. Yeah, okay. But make it meaningful. Save, like you said, save the nation, a nation which is constantly under peril. And I mean, if you don't take up arms, to quote, I think it was Golda Meir who said, if we lay down our arms, we cease to exist. We can't do that.
Yes.
Which,
Yeah.
no, they can't.
Yeah, that's right.
No.
I know. I know. Yeah, I know. Well, I think that at that moment that she goes to commit seppuku,
Mm-hmm.
and then the storm gets furious, and then she hears the crack behind her and thinks it's her friend Shira who's snuck up behind her, and she whips around and looks, and there across the pond 12 feet away is this very rare Persian fallow buck deer, which, by the way, there are Persian fallow buck deers in the Benjamin Forest, 12 prong. And he's looking at her, and she sees herself in his eyes. And at that moment, she knows it's God as you would know him. God has suddenly is, and she collapses onto the meadow grass face first. And in the book of Genesis, when Abraham has his moment in chapter 15, which some say is one of those most important moments, where it says that a dread darkness came into the camp, and the sacrifices were split, and a burning furnace went between the pieces, and it was God taking upon himself, I'm the one who's going to guarantee this covenant, not you. I'm doing it. And that dread darkness is a theme you find throughout scripture.
Mm.
The dread darkness that falls, a dread darkness fell upon Saul as he was trying to find David. And David is a dread darkness, So anyway, this a dread darkness falls upon them, and suddenly Hattie knows she's face to face with the being that holds her life together. And out of her marrow bubbles this question: what do you want? And I think that for me, that's the personal note, is I have felt at times where God comes up to me in the midst of all of my turmoil and everything, and simply asks the question very
Mm.
gently. He says, what do you want? Just, what's going on? And she says, I want to know why you killed my dad on the day of my birth.
Hmm. Yeah.
And he said, there's a pause, and he says, then leap. And in her leap, She finds rest, returns to her barracks, knowing that something titanic has shifted in her soul, though she can't put it into words. And as a result, she goes out that night on a date with her love interest, and a jihadi comes into the bar and grill and blows the place up in an attempt. It's to kill her. And of course, she wakes up 3 days later in the ICU. And now the God that she thought she has just discovered, who has brought peace and calm into her life, now she's faced with Job, and she knows nothing about Job. And now that's the beginning of the book. All I can tell potential readers is that's the beginning of the book.
Yes, and and it's fast paced from there on. I mean, it's not slow at the beginning. Of course, you have this description and what's going on with her and where she is. We need to know where she is.
Yeah.
At this point in the book, and I mean, God don't kill people. People kill people. But anyway,
yeah.
So sorry about that, but I mean, it's true, isn't it? I mean, in the end, it's her. She pulls the trigger, and everyone, it's people who do that. But what about the other character, the other main character in your book? I mean, Hadi, like you said, she's the one searching for meaning, searching or questioning her relationship with God, which she has, whether she likes it or not.
Yeah.
And what about Wolf? What about Wolf James? What about him?
Well,
how would you describe him as a character?
Well, I know that perhaps up to this point, the listener is thinking that this really sounds like a theological discourse on existentialism of God. And it is and it isn't. I mean, it is a military thriller, because what Hattie, as she contemplates suicide in the early chapters, she regrets not having met the man she met for a brief moment while mountain climbing on Mount Rainier 9 years earlier. And in that moment, I've climbed Mount Rainier, so that was the inspiration for the moment where you're actually climbing over ladders, over huge, crevasses, and you bypass people in this tiny trail, and you get to look into the eyes of people as you cross, as you pass each other. Some are coming down, others are going up in this kind of silent, because it's exhausting. Climbing is exhausting. And she has this moment where she sees this guy with the bushy beard, this tousled chocolate hair, rock-like granite man. And it's like he has amber eyes, golden eyes, orange golden eyes. And she looks into his eyes, and there's a connection which she recognizes. That's whom I was born for, that man. And yet they continued to climb past each other. And now she's considering suicide, going, if only I had met him. Well, Wolf is an ex-Ranger, Ranger Army, retired. He's a master sergeant, but he was first sergeant. He's been in 3 tours of duty, 4 tours in the Middle East, and my son is 3 tours of duty. So I get a lot of I was in the military, but my son has tangible fingertip kind of experience. And Wolf has the same experience when he looks across and sees this black-eyed beauty pass him, and he says, but it turns out, as the reader will learn, both of them are Ukrainian, and both are, she's not an orphan. I mean, she has a mom and dad, but Wolf is an orphan. And I've spent years. I spent a lot of time with a Jungian psychotherapist, in going through stuff, and I would often write chapters. The chapters that I wrote for the book would be what I presented to her every week as my unconscious material. And Martha Blake is a senior counselor, and she'd always go, "Oh, I'll be in the airport someday reading your book." And Martha just had this sense that you're on to something here. And so Wolf is this guy who, because people have asked, your book deals with Ukraine and Russia, and here we are in this, all of this stuff. How did you know about that, 10 years ago? And Martha said, well, with Carl Jung, there is a collective unconscious. And she says the themes that you picked up, the tension and the stress in the world, sometimes writers will pick up on, and they express what they don't understand. And so I'm writing about these two, and they're both from Odessa, Ukraine. And Wolf is a guy who now has mustered out of the army. He's now a New York detective police officer, and he really wants to go back and try and find the answer to who killed his family. Who killed his family? They were murdered. They were burned alive, and yet then he was adopted by another Ukrainian businessman. So you've got a guy who has for 9 years looked for this Israeli beauty, and finally he has given up. He starts to do charcoal sketchings of, and so his office or his studio apartment is filled with these sketches, and it's his then girlfriend, who says, "Oh my goodness, clearly these sketches reveal something that's really hurting in you, and you're trying to heal from the inside out." And so there's a very powerful love interest between Wolf James, who's looking for her and gives up, and Hattie, who wants to find him and is going to commit suicide. Yeah.
Yeah, well, she's not, dear listeners, because then the book would have been over, which is not. Yeah, so
we can't have that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
of
I know
course.
we can't have that. But at the same time, I felt that X is, in this case, a Ukrainian oligarch, also based on a true individual. All of this, I find all these characters from real life.
Yeah.
And this individual, there's a huge Wikipedia biography on this guy, and he's dead now, but during his time on this planet, he was a billionaire oligarch who was Jewish. And all of these scams and the scams he put over the Canadian stock market and international markets, he defrauded people of millions and millions of dollars, and he was bad. And so X is the bad guy, and as it turns out, X has started a syndicate, a mob syndicate, the Ukrainian syndicate. Yep. And it's that syndicate who's responsible for extorting Wolf's family's father, who doesn't give in, and they kill him. So now we know that Wolf is after someone related to this Sakharov syndicate. And as we will discover, it all links back to X. Hattie is on the lookout. Now she's on the trail for X, though she doesn't really know his name. And now the reader knows Wolf wants Hattie, but they don't even know each other exists. They both want X, and they're not even sure where he is, but they're going to get him.
Mm. Hopefully they get him.
Yeah, that's right.
Maybe not, dear listeners.
Yeah,
maybe
that's right.
not.
It does come down to the wire.
Yes, yes. And there are other interests involved. Like I said before, I mean, it's not just X who has a beef in the game, but there's also the Japanese involved in the game and
Well,
others.
Yeah, X has his the enforcer for the Sakharov Syndicate is Ivan Jurek, who is these are all psychopaths. I mean,
Yes.
he's a as a physician, I go, is it a psychopath or a sociopath? And you can get into all the literature on how you distinguish. But bottom line, these are individuals whose empathetic score, and there are measures of empathy, is essentially zero.
Yeah.
They have you and I have on a regular test would score, let's say, a 7 or an 8. We have a sense for the feeling of someone else going through something that you're not going through. You empathize with that person. You feel for them.
Yes.
The psychopath or sociopath has no empathy. They are a blank slate. So cries and all of the things that are going on in that person or creatures, whether it's a cat, a dog, whatever it might be, fall on deaf ears. And their trauma stimulates something in them that whatever. And so Ivan Jurek has his own issues.
Indeed, he does. To put it mildly, do you think, as a physician and having read widely in this regard, do you think that these kind of personalities are drawn to politics, stronger drawn to certain professions and politics, unlike other people?
I would say this in my research on pathophysiology and sociopathy, and there is a sociopathy index as well. These are psychometric tests, like the IQ tests. They're psychometric tests that have been developed and then tested by researchers so that they have validity. If you score such and such, it means there's a really good chance this is where you're at. If you score more than 20 on the psychopathy index, it means you're probably a psychopath. Well, when you look at the pool of people who are psychopaths, the psychopathy is a fascinating personality disorder because they are successful. They are sociable. They can be the life of the party. They can tell jokes like you cannot believe. They can win you over like this. And in fact, it's well known that there's a certain percentage of successful CEOs, whatever corporation you want, whether it's auto or steel or in politics, you find in other words, to be a psychopath doesn't mean that you are an unsuccessful person in the sense that you're a derelict in the gutter. It means you can be very successful and there are reasons for your success. And so Fusako Kidashirakawa, who is the private secretary of X, she's the granddaughter of Goru, who's the Yamaguchi Gumi Yakuza crime syndicate in Japan, the largest, by the way. And she is a psychopath. And so she's beautiful and she's an assassin. She's extremely dangerous. But in the second book, I delve much more into her character because in the second book, we're laying the foundation for how she comes to hold in her hand something that in the first book is beyond the pale.
Does she have? I was wondering about her because she was striking and she was interesting as a side character in your first book.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
have to
yeah.
admit. And does she have, or does a person who's a psychopath, do these people have redeeming qualities, character qualities at all? Or do they just
Well,
pretend to have them? Do they play the role of someone who has those redeeming character traits, or do they
I
have them?
if you look at history or politics through the lens of Machiavelli, then we know that from Machiavelli on, politics is defined not by good or evil or good morals or bad morals or boy, that's a great person or a bad person. That's why I would vote for that. It's defined by power.
Mm,
It's simply
mm,
this is about power and who holds power. And so for Fusako, all of her intrigues and everything that she's doing ultimately is she wants to ascend to become not the first
mm,
woman, but really the second woman in history to become a Yakuza crime boss that is
okay.
a female gender
Yeah.
who holds the power. And in the first book, there's a there's a music box that
Mm,
holds a mystery key to it. Well, in the second book, there's another box that holds a clue that if Fusako can get her hands on it, means that she could extort the nations of the world.
mm.
She holds a virus like creation. That's in the second book. So
Ah,
we understand more about Fusako in her. She's brilliant. She's attractive. She's deadly. She can be happy and funny and go lucky and just kill you the next moment without thinking about it. So that's Fusako.
mm,
So in that triumvirate, we have X, we have Fusako and Ivan Jurek,
yeah.
who, by the way, also want to assassinate X, but that's a subplot.
Yes.
And then we have the fact that X he's developing plutonium tipped rockets to destroy Jerusalem. And so we learn about Francois Lecomte, the French plutonium genius,
Yeah.
who is seduced into going to X by Brianna Ivanova, the Russian escort, who is the finest or most expensive escort in Moscow at the time. She's Lomonosov University trained. She loves Nabokov and Shakespeare, and she knows Japanese. So we have what I wanted to investigate with what I was intrigued with Francois and Brianna is Brianna has to seduce Francois because her daughter has been kidnapped by Ivan Jurek. She has to do this.
Mm.
And at first she says, of course, she's loath to do this. She imagines that Francois Lecomte is another fat, entitled, whatever. And she discovers that he's a kind of a California surfer looking, he's a hunk. And yet Francois is a total Einstein in his head. He's just out of it. He lives in plutonium. And so she has to seduce this man, and that moment will come in the Beirut Iris and Bar. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm wondering now that you describe her also, she's also an interesting character, and I'm wondering, will she make a reappearance in book 2?
I haven't decided yet.
Okay.
I've started the second book, and I had to go back to ground zero with the second
Okay.
book. That means starting the second book, I have wiped everyone off the table except Hattie.
Okay. I'm just wondering, because the way you describe her and how you describe her also in the book, Brianna, she reminds me a little bit of the kind of people the teacup described to me who came to the shop in Vienna and who came as translator, for the people who were the new rich in Russia, not cultured, didn't know anything. And you have these people who had to work as translators and tour guides, so to speak, and those were the ones who had culture, who knew about things, who had a family tradition of, being educated, knowing things, and yet here they are the employees of this new rich, uneducated, uncultured, but
yes,
rich people.
I mean, Brianna has saved all this money so that she can escape to Japan with her daughter Uliana, who's 5 years old, because she hates what she has become.
Yeah.
She had her life, quote, together, even as this escort. And I've read a lot of literature on the escort world. And these are women who are very much women in their own right. And you have to approach them as, okay, let's create a real person who sees what she's doing is this is her life. And yet she ends up getting kind of seduced by Ivan Jurek and starts doing his bidding and comes to loathe that relationship, says, I'm going to escape. Of course, Jurek finds out and puts an end to that. So now Jurek is saying, if you want your daughter back, you must seduce this man.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I've been intrigued with, in Jungian literature, there's something called the impossible love. And we have historical examples of the impossible love. Heloise, and I can't remember the monk in Middle Ages. What was his name? Anyway, we have the impossible loves of famous individuals who are 16 years older than the girl, or 20 years. Even Kierkegaard was for a while betrothed to his girl. She was like 18 and he was 32. I mean, there was a huge time but that was not thought to be a problem.
Yes, not at that time. Maybe.
Yeah, it wasn't. And Kierkegaard evidently was quite a catch. He had quite an inheritance, and so he wasn't, But anyway, she realizes suddenly when she meets Francois across the bar table that she's falling in love with him, and it's the very thing she cannot do. She can't fall in love with the guy that she's trying to seduce into the clutches of Ivan Jurek. That's the worst thing.
Yeah.
If Francois find out, he would want to kill her. So she's put in a position of what's called the impossible love. How do I love a man that I cannot fall in love with? How can this be? And that was part of that story, is how they end up working within the story. And at the very last chapter, we find out there's always a surprise ending.
Yes, there is. There always is. Now that you spoke of impossible love, it made me think of the tragic love. I have to say, dear listeners, I had to read Goethe at school, and we had to read Werther, and he blows out his brain, and I thought, why? Even at 16, I thought, why would you do that? There are other women. Yeah. Get over it. Come on.
Yeah.
Are you dumb or what? I mean, really. Seriously, because there is another version of Goethe's Werther, a modern one, which I liked way better, because although the guy dies, he didn't intend to die. It was an accident.
Yeah.
So it was more relatable. Is it? Oh, he was tragically in love, and he didn't want to die. There was a mishap with a tool he created, and he died accidentally.
Yeah.
It was more like my
That almost sounds
for
like
me.
Kafka to me.
Yeah,
Of course,
tragic,
Kafka is just amazing.
and strange, but also a bit strange.
Yeah. Oh, yes, I know. I'm not saying by amazing. It's just my way of saying, wow. When I read Kafka, I'm just always like kind of putting my mind on the shelf for a moment, going, oh my goodness gracious. But he certainly makes you look at yourself in
Yes, but
very,
yes,
yeah,
yes, but you do wonder what was going on in this man's mind, don't you?
yeah, I know. But it
Mm.
was Camus who captured my interest most with it, when we between Staff Sergeant Hattie Abrams and Shira in that first chapter when they're talking about Nietzsche and
Mhm.
Kierkegaard, and finally it's Shira. Hattie says, I've just really lost an interest in living, and Shira says, you mean Camus' coffee cup? And of course, Camus was the one who reduced all of philosophy from Plato on
Mhm.
3,000 years for that to one question is it really ends up, you ask yourself, do you want to drink your cup of coffee in the morning or not?
Yes, I do. I'm a coffee drinker.
And if you say yes,
It's not even a
then you're
question.
engaged in what life is all about. If if life has no meaning and you don't want to drink the coffee, then take yourself out. Get it over with.
Nope, I'm a coffee drinker. I have to drink
Yeah.
something.
I know. Same here.
And I mean, seriously, I mean, life has meaning. If you have a cat, you know life has meaning, dear listeners.
Yeah, that's
On a
right.
more on a more upbeat note.
Yeah.
Not we do not want to get too dark here. You've
Yeah.
told us about your plans. I mean, like you said, book 2 is in the making. May I also ask what would be your advice for any other author out there?
Well, I started writing the book in 2000, and now it's we're almost into 2025. And it has been a long journey of ups and downs and all sorts of things. But in 2016, I had a crisis moment in my life with regard to work, and I didn't know what I was going to do. And I sought the advice of this Jungian counselor, Martha Blake. And I had a dream. And if you know anything about Jungians, she got out her pen and paper and went, tell me your dream. And in this dream, I dreamt, I saw Robert Frost, the American poet, laying on his back under a clear mountain stream. And the water flowed over him. He was on the bottom, very much alive, like a fish, and the surface was covered with ice. And his hands were against the underside of the ice. He's trying to get out. The moonlight had come up, and there was some melting of the edges. And she said, she looked at me most curiously and said, well, have you ever been a poet? I'd spent 50 years as a doctor, studying. And I said, well, way back in high school. And she said, well, maybe there's a poet in you wanting to come out. And that crystallized in an instant the direction my life was to take full ons. And I put everything in the past away and I turned my attention to writing this book completely. And I think for aspiring writers, I think it was Faulkner it was Steinbeck or Faulkner. One of them said, he came up with the idea for one of his famous novels when he imagined this little girl sitting on the branch of a tree. She was up in a tree sitting on this branch. He saw it. And from that, he wrote this amazing book. I think that inspiration strikes us in ways that we are, if I think it was Emily Dickinson who said that when the poem would come, it's like a wind that would cross her and she'd run to catch up with the poem. I think that sometimes we have to sit down and just say, I'm going to start writing. And maybe you say, I'm going to start writing journal entries or letters to somebody, or you ask a question. But ultimately, you're looking for that moment. For me, when the wind, the slight breeze brushes past me and I go, hey, wait a minute, that's it. That's what I'm chasing. And you start writing on that and it unfurls from that moment. Or the dream, the unconscious says, hey, by the way, listen, this is what's going on here. And I think a characteristic true of all writers is we read. Writers are readers. And I have read voraciously all my life and read all of the Jason Bournes and all of my, the Elizabeth Sounder and the Millennium Trilogy, which is one of my favorite ones. I've read these things again and again until finally the moment came where I said, I can write this. I can do this. I have a story to tell. And then finally you start writing. And for me, it was, I have to give the reader a reason to turn the page. It has to be something that I find fun to read myself, that I can return to 10 years from now and be fun just reading it. But it has to offer the reader has to have a reason to turn the page. If it's so dull that they can put it away, then that's not my kind of writing. I like thrillers. So those are kind of my little watchwords. I'm always waiting for the slight breeze or the little picture or whatever, and want to listen to dreams and all of those things. I don't know.
Oh, perfect. And we all know, dear listeners, that the teacup likes to write shopping lists.
That's right.
Yeah, well, why not? Also, quite all right with me.
That's
Perfectly written shopping lists are also something to look forward to. Bruce, is there anything else you would like our listeners to know?
Well, often I've read a short portion of the book, but I don't know if we have the time for it.
Why not?
I mean, it gives the readers or listeners kind of a sense for...
Perfect. Yes.
Okay.
Hand the screen over to you then.
Okay, so this is day 23 in Legrana, Greece. Tuesday, October 10th is 0300 hours. The Astria, which is a cigarette racer, floated quietly in Legrana while Hattie slept with one eye open. At 3 a.m., the engines gurgled and the lights of the port city faded from her window. Hungry, she stole into the galley. The wheelhouse door lay ajar, and she overheard the captain say, "The syndicate won the bid." The seaman replied in tandem, "How much?" $48,000. But when Piaro sees her, I think more, replied Captain Dimas. We'll take her tonight in Marsala. Warn Xuthus, no touching. A cold wave of fear spiraled down Hattie's spine, and she crept back to the stateroom. She practiced breathing and calmed down, but her stomach continued to growl for food. An hour passed, and Hattie opened the door. The engines roared and the waves splashed as the boat sliced through the water. She steadied her movements against the bouncing by keeping her hands on the wall. Cool air met her face, the odors of food and carnauba wax mixed together. Hattie touched her Glock and the knife tucked in her waistband. A single light cast a dim glow over the stove in the narrow, deserted galley. Balancing herself, Hattie planted her feet on the tiled floor as the vessel bounced and swayed. She filled a bowl with stew and toast and a loaf of bread. Hattie heard a rustling behind her and whipped around. Xuthus had the same idea of an early morning snack, and in the soft light, Hattie's silhouette stood out. The big man downshifted to first gear. His motion slowed as two small eyes fixed themselves on the woman like lasers. He put down his plate, the size of a tea saucer, in his hand, and stepped toward her, mesmerized by this shiny toy. Xuthus reached out. His fingers touched inches from Hattie's face, and speaking in a high-pitched cat-like meow, said, "Let me pet your hair." Hattie instinctively stepped back and bumped against the stove. Her right hand went to the pistol, while the other pushed the lion's paw aside. "Not today, big fella, or ever," she said, and glanced left and right for a way out. Xuthus' eyes hardened and voice darkened. "I want to pet it." With surprising quickness, the giant stretched out his arms like albatross wings and boxed her in. He towered over her. "The captain won't hear, and don't scream like the others." Hattie's chest seized in panic. Her body became mush as her worst fear materialized like a ghost ship from the fog. The Glock had no legs. The knife had no hands. Xuthus squealed in delight and put his palm on her head, then grabbed one breast. Like a magician's fire, Hattie's rape flashed up. She was falling under blows from long ago, tied up and spread open for this giant. The claustrophobia clamped down on her throat. Xuthus touched her pelvis. Suddenly, in her chest, Hattie felt the fiery lightsaber come alive and an inner voice say, "When you hear the blast of war, summon your rage and strike like a tiger." Like an explosion from a cannon, Hattie's hand shot out. Aiming for the back of Xuthus' throat, her fingers sliced through his skin like the paper bag. They stopped at the spinal cord. On their way out, the fingers snapped shut like a bear trap. It ripped out the windpipe, arteries, veins, and all. Blood sprayed like water from fire hydrants over the ceiling and walls of the galley. Xuthus turned pale. His eyes glazed over. The giant toppled like a redwood and landed on the floor with a loud crash. A pool of dark blood spread out beneath the Leviathan as the skipper rushed in and yelled for his mates. The younger seaman ran in and saw his brother. He fell on the mountain of flesh and let out a blood-curdling scream. The skipper and the barrel-chested seaman stared open-mouthed at the terrible blonde who held an enormous chicken neck in her hand. As her blood boiled, Hattie snarled, "Fresh meat for your fucking fish stew."
Couldn't have said it better. Bruce, thank you so much for joining me. It was an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, vice versa. Vice versa.
And
Enjoyed
please, same here. And please don't go away. I will join you again shortly in the green room.
Okay, well, it's on drbrucefarmer.com is the website. Yeah, and it's on Amazon. So just go to Amazon. You got Audible and all of the various things. You can just order it.
Absolutely. And I will put the links in the description of the episode as well.
Yeah,
especially to your homepage. Absolutely. Oh. Like I said, I will join you shortly in the green room. Don't go away.
Okay, bye-bye.
Dear listeners, I do hope you enjoyed this episode as much as my guest and I did. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and I hope you will join again for another episode of Book Lovers Companion. Until next time.